So Canadian Physicians for Life has started offering book groups, mainly oriented to member physicians and medical students, in order to deepen our understanding of bioethics. We get together to look at different books. The first book we did was Carter Sneed's book, What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics. And that was a really interesting book that did a legal survey of life issues from beginning of life issues to end of life issues. It focused mainly on the American legal system, but it certainly had lessons and points of view that were useful in the Canadian system. Then we also most recently looked at Charles Camosy's new book, Losing Our Dignity, How Secularized Medicine is Undermining Fundamental Human Equality. Now, this book was a little bit more accessible, more storytelling, I think, than the other book, which was written by a law professor, so it was more legal focused. And so today I'm here with Amanda, who's a member of our team, to just talk through the book on losing our dignity, kind of talk about what we learned and recap it a little bit. So you'll get a taste of the kinds of things we talk about and how important they are to our deepening our understanding of bioethics. So I'm so happy you could join me today, Amanda.
Thank you, Nicole. It's good to be here. And this was a really great read. Everyone enjoyed it. We went through it in 4 weeks back to back, and it was accessible and engaging. So for anyone looking for a current read on bioethics, this one by Charles Camosy, Losing Our Dignity, can be highly recommended. So we're going to sketch a bit of the outline of the book, share with you some of the things that came up in the course of our book discussion with residents and medical students and some longer time physicians who all lent incredible insights through the course of our book group. Now, I want to begin by reading the first paragraph of the introduction, in which he writes, "Take a moment to think about people in your extended family and other social circles. It may not come to our conscious attention very often, but I suspect most of us have encountered a wide range of human difference, especially when it comes to neurological diversity. An uncle braving Alzheimer's disease, a cousin's prematurely born child fighting for her life in the bed of a neonatal intensive care unit, a neighbor and war veteran suffering mental illness from post-traumatic stress disorder, a daughter's genius classmate who is off to college next year at age 15, a ridiculously happy younger brother with Down syndrome. The list of examples could be nearly endless. We think even less often, I suspect, about what makes all these different kinds of human beings equal." And this is what he begins to discuss with the fundamental human equality. We may think that everyone is equal, but what is the basis for this equality? And what really becomes the criterion or criteria against which we're measuring and evaluating a meaningful life? So then throughout this book, he goes on to discuss many contemporary and very familiar examples. Some may be less familiar, but definitely some that you've probably heard of, like Terry Schiavo or Alfie Evans. And so we're going to share a little bit about those stories. And I'd also like to say that because these are such current stories, we often began the book group with watching a YouTube video of someone from a family who is affected and who is discussed kind of journalistically in the book, in order to see their faces, see these family members fighting for their loved ones who were, because of whatever condition or situation they were experiencing, were not able to advocate for themselves. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole to kick us off with sketching a little bit about the flow of the book.
Yeah, sure. So I actually think that foundational question is really interesting and one that's really worth teasing out and thinking about. So how do you and why do you value people? Like where does their value come from? And I think all of us have a philosophy of value. We have even if it's unstated or we maybe haven't thought it through, we kind of know in our gut why we think someone is valuable or not. And one of the problems that I see right now in medicine is that utilitarian philosophy has really seeped into medicine, so that you're only worthwhile when you're able-bodied and can contribute. And once you're not, when you're vulnerable, when you are no longer going to recover, or if you're disabled, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, you have the medical profession taking the view that it's a waste of resources to care for you. And I think that, to me, that was the punch in the gut from this book, was seeing some of these cases where things did go horribly wrong for these families and they didn't get the care they absolutely deserved. And I think that was really interesting then to discuss it with physicians who had a wide range of experiences and medical students and residents, and get their perspectives, and also to see the development of perspective as we talk through those cases. I thought that was really interesting as well.
Yeah, that's right. And he's talking about whether people with different, as he likes to say, visions of the good can come together in affirming fundamental human equality, because there are different starting points and there are different underlying conceptions really competing now. And so he says, and he tries to reaffirm, that claims about human equality don't flow from one's level of autonomy or self-awareness or rationality, productivity, or even moral capacity, but really insists on recapturing fundamental human equality and dignity that's rooted in human beings having a shared nature, because the tenuousness and the vulnerability of being human is something that threatens and jeopardizes that recognition of the shared nature, which makes everyone worth fighting for at every stage of life so important and worthy of not losing sight of. But when we get confused and when we put other things in the place of fundamental equality based on a shared nature or on fundamental human dignity, and we make the criteria something about autonomy, rationality, then the kinds of persons who he discusses throughout this book really end up suffering our abandonment and our mistaking of basically our dejecting of them from the membership within the human family. And so he's trying to say, let's err on the side of not excluding anyone from our human family.
Yeah, and I think that takes us nicely into the first case that he looked at, which was Jahai McMath. And she was, I think, 13 or 12, maybe, when she went in for some surgery that went horribly wrong, and she ended up with a catastrophic brain injury and was declared dead, brain dead. And her family was really fighting for her to get good care. And they actually wanted the hospital to discharge her into their care so they could take her home and care for her at home. And the hospital didn't want to. It got quite hostile. And we really got into the whole idea of when is a person brain dead, what criteria do you use, and was that she properly diagnosed or not?
And whether brain death is really death also is part of the discussion, because when someone dies is a matter of debate. It's not so clear cut. And we also discussed and learned a little bit about how brain death became a criterion for establishing death in spite of other competing standards of evaluation for deciding and determining when someone has really died. And so Charles Camosy starts off this chapter with this sort of dramatic anecdote that Jahai got her period when she was 13, and this would have been completely unremarkable except for the fact that she had already been pronounced dead. And yet this development had happened in her life, and her family saw developments in the course of their ongoing familial relationship with one another. And that's the thing, that with each person whose stories are recounted here, the person is not dead when the family continues to be so much in relationship to them and with them that it really is startling. The doctor said about Jahai, she's dead, dead, dead. And there was debate over it. It wasn't a perfect consensus. And then we discussed and we learned a lot throughout this chapter and subsequent chapters about the struggles that minorities face to be taken seriously. We saw this a lot in the cases of the infants with the neurological challenges that they had, that doctors sometimes purported to know so much better, and whether it was a denigration on the basis of race or class, the real vulnerabilities that were leading to some families being very poorly treated within the medical system. And I think it's incredible. I think we found within our group to listen to doctors reflect on some of these stories and on some of the things that they've seen from within their offices and within their hospitals, of how there could sometimes be this dangerous tendency within the profession, and yet how much doctors within the Physicians for Life orbit are trying to humanize the medical practice, to affirm the relationships of family members, to never lose sight of the fundamental equality and dignity of each and every patient. So it's really striking and remarkable. I found it quite moving to listen to them simply reflect on the nature and meaning of their work in light of some of their own similar cases with difficult ethical and familial kind of dilemmas.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me through that too was how careful some of them are in, and how much effort they put into getting it right, to making sure that, I mean, one of the physicians who was in the book group was involved with organ transplants at one point, and he just talked about how careful they were to make sure that the person was dead before they took the organs. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure that happens all the time, but certainly the way he talked about how careful they were and how reflective he was about trying to give the very best care to the patients he worked with made me like, wow, I wish every person had him as a doctor, had an opportunity to have those kinds of doctors at their bedside who were so careful and caring, and were caring about them as a whole person.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, so big shout out for CPL doctors. Then the next case was Terry Schiavo's case, and I think almost everyone, at least everyone our age, knows about Terry Schiavo, because it was very much a part of our adulthood, right? Like, that was a big case that had a huge impact on people. And I don't know if you want to speak to that case first and kind of what your thoughts are on it.
Well, one thing that always comes to mind in light of Terry's story is I was always struck at the time, and even still today, about the use of the term vegetative state, and even more strongly vegetable. I was quite young at the time of the story, and I thought, well, a person is never a vegetable. That seems obvious, but nevertheless, we kept hearing a vegetative state and vegetable, and there's something that Camosy says when he's discussing persons in this experience, and says that if someone eventually regains consciousness and the ability to communicate, then she didn't go from being a vegetable or being a human being. No, the person is always a human being, whether that consciousness or those particular abilities that we regard as very essential to a quality of life or human flourishing. The person has the same nature and the same moral status, and being such deserves to be treated in a particular kind of way. The particular kind of way that a person deserves to be treated is always as an object of love. And so a person, no matter how or what the degenerative condition may be, if we take fundamental human equality seriously, should never really be referred to as a vegetable, because we could lose sight of the infinite mystery of the person that never disappears, no matter what kind of decline in consciousness or in ability we may see. So that's one thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that came to my mind during this chapter, and he talks about Maggie as well, who really regained a lot of cognitive functioning because of her neurologist discovered or made the observation that she was trying to communicate through blinking her eyes, and she was able then to work very hard to rewire her brain around a damaged portion. And we see that more and more, and there's more research and more therapies being made available to people with brain injuries that are allowing them to regain function and regain the ability to communicate. And you wonder sometimes if we cut off people who've suffered a brain injury too soon, or if we just decide that this population is not worth working with. What are we throwing away? What opportunities for breakthroughs in medical, in medicine are we missing because we're too quick to write them off?
Exactly. And a person doesn't become more human because technology advances. No, simply because there are means to help a person or facilitate their return to health. That fundamental human equality has been there all along, and perhaps there are varying degrees of recognizing it, but this is all the more reason to err on the side of protecting each and every person with a value for their life, even if the technology has not caught up to necessarily solve some of the things that we may like to see improved for a person's for the benefit of a person's life and well-being.
For sure. And I think the other thing that's on the flip side of it is the person doing the caring. That if you have the opportunity to care for someone who really relies on you in a way that it's you can't really necessarily say, oh, they're going to pay me back. It's a gratuitous gift of yourself in caring and generosity. It actually is incredible in terms of your personal growth. And if we never have those opportunities, we really don't stretch our capacity to love. And I know many people that I really admire have had some pretty tough health situations, either in their families or themselves, that they've had to overcome. And it's just deepened their capacity as human beings to make them really admirable and noble. And I worry that if we're too quick to get rid of or dismiss these people as not worth being, people like who are disabled or who have challenges as not worth being taken care of, we're missing an opportunity for ourselves individually and as a society to grow into a more caring society.
Yeah, that's right. And I really like that point about how when someone cannot repay you, there's definitely this tradition when it comes to burying a person and taking care of a body of someone who's passed away because that person cannot repay you. And yet we see so many other times of life where it's not only when the person has passed away, there are many other occasions where a person may not be able to repay you in ways other than that, maybe in no way that can be seen, but or maybe only in subtle signs of affection, whatever it may be. But when that love can be so sincere and without repayment, it takes on this character as a very special deed that humanizes the culture and really brings out the best in us. We sometimes go back to this quotation about appealing to a person's inner nobility, that the vulnerable person, whoever the vulnerable person is in this moment, in that moment, and at some point, likely us, makes an appeal to the other's makes an appeal to their inner nobility. And what will they draw out by virtue of their very presence that can call forth the best that we have to give, if only we take the chance and don't resist these occasions to come out of ourselves and become more fully who we can be.
Yeah, no, I think there's lots of opportunities in healthcare for that to occur. One of the things that struck me when we were talking to particularly the physicians who'd been practicing for a long period of time was how exhausting that can be, but how meaningful, and the ways that they take care of themselves so that they can come back to their jobs or their vocations fully present and ready to give again, even though it's such a challenging profession with really they have to give of themselves every single day in a way that other professions don't. And I think that's something worth thinking about as well, that you have to, if you're a physician or a medical student, you have to create a space for yourself to continue to be able to regenerate or reinvigorate yourself so that you don't get totally burnt out. But then also as a society to respect that they're human beings and that they need the support too. And we have to create our healthcare system that is more human, that allows them to function as human beings and not as automatons or service providers who are just like giving out widgets or something, right? Like boom, boom, boom. It's not very human. And so then it dehumanizes the whole system.
That's such a good point, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because often we do act as consumers toward our medical, even to call it a system is a little bit to think this way, when really we're all persons interacting. Everyone on all sides has families, relationships, struggles, anxieties, and everyone has people in their lives who are being born and who are passing away. And so to cultivate this empathy and sensitivity that we're all in this human situation, and in that sense, every patient has a responsibility to be a good patient. And certainly we've witnessed interactions in offices that are so tense, whether it's the doctors or the administrative staff or the patients. It can be tense and it can even be dehumanizing. So to put forward this idea, what responsibility do patients have, do the families have, do caregivers have, to make the overall medical experience better, and exactly to help prevent that burnout from those who are doing so much to care. Throughout the pandemic, we saw some of this acknowledgement and gratitude for healthcare workers. And so it's interesting to consider what forms of gratitude and what kinds of expression will the ongoing appreciation of much broader healthcare that happens all the time look like. Maybe not banging pots outside balconies, but what does it look like to show gratitude and appreciation in the day-to-day with those who are really taking care of the health of us and our loved ones?
Yeah, no, I think that's say thank you to your doctor. Let's put it that way. So the next chapter in the book was the Roe baby chapter, and I thought that this was a fascinating chapter in the sense that, or at least one thing that he said that really struck me was he talked about how Norma, who was the woman who was Roe, he says nearly everyone in Norma's life failed her. Many used her and several assaulted her. Like when you read what her life was before that court case, it was very challenging. And it wasn't like anyone was reaching out to try and help her. I mean, she was very focused. She did not want to have this baby. So she was maybe not necessarily open to help, but you know, people get to those situations and there's a story about why they got there, and how she really felt like she was alone, that she had no one to turn to. And even the lawyers who took on her case, they really just used her, and she ended up being so angry with them. For me, it was heartbreaking. It was a heartbreaking chapter.
Mm-hmm. And this is partly why a lot of people who go through really negative experiences of healthcare don't want to become advocates about it, even if they think they could do some good, because there's so much risk of exploitation of a story of profound vulnerability and also a lot of trauma in the past negative experiences. I'm sure we can all think of experiences that were less than ideal that we know of in this realm. And so this sort of sensitivity, and that's also why it's so important that we do find those who can speak and give voice to their story when they are prepared to do so on their own initiative, because otherwise these stories so much are hidden under the radar and we don't pay attention to the abuses. And I think we're seeing this a lot with the families who are totally taken by surprise and aghast at finding out family members who have been euthanized, and the kind of individualism we see when perhaps a whole family is unaware of the profound suffering or depression that someone has, and that they make a seemingly autonomous decision that has such ripple effects, because how can it not? We're all connected and there are relationships. And so The risk for the abuses and the trauma, when we don't have a sense of community and the trust that that minimizes, or the trust that really dissolves concerns about paternalism or exploitation, because trust in the context of the medical relationship on all sides is what gets us back to that fundamentally human encounter that can do so much to humanize society, even at large.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that just we have like kind of two ends of the debate. You have the euthanasia at end of life, and then you have abortion at beginning of life. And I think in both cases, what I see and which I think is we have to address is the loneliness, is the person feeling like they're all alone and they have nowhere to turn, and this is their answer, because they don't feel supported, they don't feel loved, they don't feel cared for, and they feel backed into a corner. And I think that's the biggest tragedy of both these situations, is the absolute abandonment by people who should have been there for them.
Exactly. It's a kind of persistent and horrible thread of presuming that someone would be better off dead. And that's really what we see also in the Alfie Evans story. Camosy writes, they kept Alfie's parents from seeking out other healthcare teams that would treat Alfie. So this is when he could have been taken and brought to be treated in another country, but he was not permitted by the authorities and by the hospitals to go and receive this treatment in a different context. So they kept Alfie's parents from seeking out other healthcare teams that would treat Alfie, not because they were concerned about how Alfie might experience a short trip in the air ambulance, but because they thought it was in Alfie's best interest to die. And so all these cases where there's this presumption that that would be better, and is it really a sense of regard for the good of the person? Because how could we really say reasonably of anyone that they would be better off dead? There's a real contradiction there. However, this it just really also comes up throughout the book, how the question when we really confront ourselves is, can the person in the situation not tolerate their situation, or can we not abide it? Are we too impatient, uncomfortable, worn out, that we ourselves are the ones who think it would be better off if this person was not in our lives? And if that's the case, what does it say about us, about our priorities, about the tenor of our culture, and all of these kinds of things? Is it really about regard for the person? Are they the center? And at this moment, the person who is most vulnerable, have they become the center of concern? Or have we made ourselves and our priority, our agenda, our timelines, our ability to take vacations, anything like that, the center of concern in their place?
Yeah, and I think the other, on the flip side of that, or from the medical side, oftentimes it's the physician saying, I wouldn't want to live like that, or I can't see myself living like that, therefore that life has no value or meaning. And one of the things that happened at our conference in 2018, which I thought I was new at Canadian Physicians for Life, and the conference had a speaker called Brandon Bosma, and Brandon has mosaic trisomy 18. In fact, he's the only individual alive in Canada with that genetic syndrome
Condition.
Yeah, because most babies are aborted when they have that syndrome. And it was interesting because he gave this presentation to the medical students and physicians, and he contrasted pictures from the medical textbooks of people like him with pictures of his childhood and other children. And it was really a slap in your face, because the pictures in the medical textbook were quite dehumanizing. And then the pictures of him, and he had a friend who, she was in her father's sports car. And I mean, it was just totally different, and a different kind of feel and a different perspective. And it just struck many in that audience like so forcefully that he was, he was a face. and a person and a lived experience that was outside of their realm of possibility or realm of understanding. And so one of the medical students actually got him to come and speak to her medical student class, and really change people's perspectives, because they had a chance to interact with someone who was like a living example of something that in their textbook that they'd never seen and that they were told was not compatible with life, like that people with this genetic disposition could not live. And granted, most of them do die, but many of them their lives are ended early through abortion, because the view is that their lives are not worth living.
Yeah, and that also reminds me of how Camosy speaks about the different ways that children are spoken of before they're born, whether they're wanted and whether there's a lot of confidence in their health and longevity, or whether there's anxiousness and nervousness about what conditions or vulnerabilities they may have, or whether the child is unwanted. And I think that's a really interesting point that that really gets to the challenge of where is that fundamental human equality? Is it really underlying our conception? If there's one set of answers and responses and reactions to some, but a different one to others, and on what basis is there this discrepancy? It really throws to us a lot of questions about how we live and what we value and who we value.
And also what we know. I mean, I think one of the things that was really interesting in the Alfie Evans chapter was they talked about, there was that young girl whose name escapes me right now that they talked about, where she actually was able to get out of the UK and into Italy to get treatment. And the Italian doctors were really talking about, like, there's so much we don't know. And we're trying to support her and help her develop and see how much she can heal. But there's so much we don't know, and standing in front of the mystery of the unknown and being comfortable with that and saying, we don't know, so we're going to care, instead of we don't know, so we're going to cut this off or stop this. Right. And I think that's just a totally different attitude towards life, and also a certain humility. It takes a certain humility to say, I don't know, and I'm not sure how this will develop, but let's see where it goes.
Right. And it's a humility that goes hand in hand with a kind of reverence before a lot of mysterious things. And this is not about prolonging life to no end and at all costs. It's about proper accompaniment, especially of families who are fighting for their loved ones, and especially when there is exactly this competing opinions by professionals. I think when we see the discrepancy, it's when it's so clear. It's in these difficult bioethical issues where there is not unanimity, there is not a consensus, and this is why we get so worked up about it. Not because we are transhumanists who think people should live forever and ever, or that there should be no natural death. No, we understand and accept when someone needs to die a natural death, and we want to accompany that person to each natural death in a way that is befitting their equality and dignity. And so I think it's a really important distinction that we're alert and sensitive to when we see a discrepancy in treatment or care, where someone who was of a certain demographic or of a certain profile would get one response and reaction, whereas someone else, by virtue of their background or their standard of living, or like, that's where it's really messy, and that's where we cannot afford to be giving different tiered efforts to people based only on bases which are not related to their fundamental human equality.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting you say that. One of the things that came up in a previous bioethics course that we ran, the professor, Professor Christina Lamb, was talking about some of her experience in Rwanda, where she didn't have a lot of medical interventions at her fingertips. But she said sometimes all you can do is sit with the person and be with them, because they have suffered a catastrophic injury that you can't do anything about, but you're there with them. And I think that whole idea of accompaniment and not abandoning the person is really important at every level, as a society, in the family, and even in the medical profession.
Definitely.
So let's go to his last, and I would say most
Sure.
challenging chapter, called Dementia and Beyond. And he really goes hard at this one, because I think for him, he sees this as a big problem that is coming down the pipe, so to speak. And how are we going to meet it with care, or are we going to meet it with ending people's lives quickly and early because of this issue of dementia? So what's your perspective on it? I'll let you take it first.
Yeah, that's right. I remember we had quite a discussion within the book group around Peter Singer, and this kind of opens the section where he's talking about how Peter Singer was very consistent in his positions about those who kind of lose their rationality and autonomy, don't deserve to be regarded as persons. They may be human, but here's what he says about this. Sometime after making this claim, however, his mother, Peter Singer's mother, became precisely the kind of human non-person that he was describing. Like many millions of others in her late 60s, Cora Singer developed dementia and lost her rationality and self-awareness. Singer is well known for living out his stated moral positions with consistency, but in this situation, Singer could not maintain his consistency. Despite his stated point of view, he committed substantial financial resources to the care and treatment of his mother. When asked about this for a New Yorker story, he said, "Perhaps it is more difficult than I thought before, because it is different when it's your mother." So, and then we discussed how there had been responses to this other people's mother kind of discussion, and having, again, different sets of paradigms. And yeah, what difference does it make when someone is close to us, when the cost-saving measures or the utilitarian calculations, when we see them for what they are because of our own immediate and intimate experience with vulnerability at end of life? I think this, with Alzheimer's and dementia, we especially see the confrontation, the challenge to us, is it we ourselves who cannot tolerate it, or is the person really struggling and suffering? We know that it's difficult for us to abide. It's difficult to watch loved ones forget who we are. It's confusing, and it can be very destabilizing to the relationship. But if you have had that personal experience of caring for someone with Alzheimer's or dementia, or even better sometimes, witnessing the tenderness and the perseverance of those who do, you know how absolutely transformative those encounters and that perseverance is. It does something to you, and that person changes you, softens your heart, reminds you of all kinds of things by drawing you out of yourself. And sometimes you need to repeat things again and again and again. But what does that teach us? Don't we all need to do things sometimes with greater frequency, to sometimes have more often reminders again and again? So I often like to kind of wonder about, why does dementia happen? Not why biologically or physiologically, but what does this really broad phenomenon have for us to reveal to us about the human condition, to reveal to us about the nature of love, the nature of relationships? Is there something about it that's in it for us, if only we have eyes to see, really?
Yeah, well, I have two thoughts about that. One of them is the structure of our society. I was having a discussion with a physician. Well, she's a medical resident here. She did her medical school in Nigeria and practiced medicine there, and then came to Canada and has had to write like exams and do her residency here too. But she just talked about We talked about how we care for the elderly here as opposed to in Nigeria, where they actually live at home. And even in South America, you see that more often, where in those societies, elderly parents, elderly aunts and uncles are cared for within the family structure. So there's a lot more, first of all, there's a lot more interaction with people. And so I don't think dementia takes its toll the way it does here, where they're isolated or people are put into long-term care and they're left alone and they don't, they have poor staffing ratios. And so they're on their own a lot and not speaking. And then you have the pandemic, of course, where many of them were locked in their rooms for a year or two. And it's just was so hard, where they just lost the ability to speak because they weren't speaking to people. So you have those two things. And I think in that case, maybe there's a call to us as a society to think a bit more about how we care for our parents, our aunts and uncles, those who are older who need care, and can we have them in our families? Can we make room for them?
Yeah, that's a great point to jump into actually some of his points of consideration for how to reverse this kind of throwaway culture and discarding people from membership within the human family. Thankfully, it's not only a doom and gloom book, but it's also a book looking at some really constructive ideas for improving on all of these different fronts. And a lot of them have to do with what he calls resisting throwaway culture. And his previous book was by that title. So he's sounding the alarm about the need to recover fundamental equality and dignity. And some of the ideas are to put families first. Exactly this. How can families have more intergenerational solidarity? How can families live in a way that involves making choices where family members actually need to rely and depend on one another? Too much autonomy is actually detrimental for relationships. So what are the means for greater mutuality that would actually enhance the relationships between family members? He talks about this also in connection with resisting the sort of cultural consumerism, where there's a sort of rootlessness. And also he discusses smaller families and how by having larger families, there's the benefit of multiple caregivers, because it's true that caring for aging parents can be very demanding, especially if both parents suddenly require that additional help and support regularly. Then having children and grandchildren who are close by to support those family members become key. But he also is keen to point out that we can broaden beyond the nuclear family and think of creative ways to work out spaces of greater intergenerational solidarity. I remember hearing about some nursing homes where students, university students would live, especially music students, and the seniors loved when the music students would move into the nursing home, and they'd have like amazing classical concerts all the time, and it was great all around. The students had affordable accommodations, and the seniors had stimulating, elevating music to listen to. Or we've heard of kindergartens and seniors' homes and things like this, which will hopefully continue to be possibilities, because that contact is so fruitful for everyone. I also like that he just very bluntly says, as another tip, refuse to have family members cared for by robots when other options are available. And it's like, wow, this is the extent to which we've gotten, where we need to kind of think, oh, can we care instead of AI for our grandparents, for example? So those are some of them. Did you have any others that struck you from his series of recommendations?
Yeah, one of the things that I really like, and I think I've seen some people take up this challenge, and I would really encourage the wider community to do that, is to volunteer in retirement homes or long-term care, to go in and visit, to go in and participate with the individuals there. Now, of course, it was very hard during the COVID pandemic to do that, but now that things are opening up, it's a great opportunity to go in and chat, to go in, and if you have a dog, to take a dog, and it's a dog that likes people, to go in and do some pet visiting, to go in and just have conversations. And that's just, I think those interactions and that integrating the wider community with the residents in a retirement home or a long-term care home is a way we can make a meaningful difference. I think one of the reasons that people kind of decline so quickly is because they stop losing that feeling that their lives are meaningful, that they still have something to contribute. And when seniors feel like they still have interactions that they can, they could give advice to a teenager. You could go in and say, well, what do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? I'm having this problem in my life. What do you think? And they have a lot of lived experience and can give you some really good insight. And so I think there's a wealth of knowledge there that's at your fingertips that you could tap into. So even though you think you're the one giving, I think you will find that you will receive as much when you get involved and have those kinds of relationships that maybe you are farther away from grandparents or parents. Maybe they're no longer in your life. They may have passed on and they're not around anymore. It's a great way to build a richness into your life by integrating into, people, places in your community where you would have more interaction with individuals who are older than you.
Oh, that's so true. Throughout the pandemic, I was matched with an 89-year-old gentleman named Don, with whom I had a phone call every week on Wednesday for an hour and a half. And I can certainly say that those calls probably did more for me than they did for him. He is so full of energy and was always teaching me new things and also helping give perspective, because for me, I found it really heartening to have a conversation with someone older who wasn't interested in all the same kinds of things other people at like networking receptions might ask me about, like, what are you doing next? Or what's your plan for your life? No, he would always ask, like, how are you doing? And he really wanted to know. And that really just got to me, where I was like, wow, like, he's interested in how I'm doing, not what I'm doing or what I'm doing next. And that was a real like example to me of just the kind of immediate affection and trust, and also just the value of those relationships of intergenerational solidarity, where we need one another to be reminded of these things. So very worthwhile.
Kudos for you for making the effort. I think that's one of the hardest things to overcome is our own busyness, our own, maybe even our own, a little bit of laziness, or just, it's just one more thing. And to think about, okay, how can I grow? How can I contribute? How can I make a difference? And to find these points of being significant in someone's life in a way that's generous and giving of yourself. And I think those are really important growth points that we should all seek.
Mm-hmm. And we can also ask ourselves, what are we doing that's more important than the kinds of connections with people in our lives who help bring out the best in us? And so what might seem time consuming or this kind of thing eventually becomes like the favorite part of your day. Whenever we spend times with those we love, we realize that far from being demanding in a way that we regret, it ends up always being a highlight that makes life most worth living. And so I think just also stepping back and in light of everything we've all lived and endured in the recent years, exactly as you say, kind of rehabilitating what will our lives and our rhythm and our routines look like now that we're getting to have the possibility to have those encounters more and more. I think we've all missed them. And the question is, have we learned from our missing of them? Or have we been conditioned and suppressed in what are the real human longings that I hope so dearly that we can really rehabilitate for the good of our culture and for the good of ourselves?
Yeah. And on that note, I think for me, the book group was one of those great experiences. I really looked forward to that hour each Saturday to sit and talk with people with such a richness of experience and knowledge to draw on. It was such a great experience. And I really encourage people to keep their eyes open for our next book group. And and join us, because it's an experience well worth having, I think, Amanda.
Definitely.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll wrap up for today. And thank you so much for being with me. And we'll do this again soon.
My pleasure. See you.
Good night.